Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Globe webinar series on the future of global governance. I am Carrie Otterburn of the Leuven Center for the Global Governance Studies, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Today, we are joined by Professor Augusto Lopez-Claros to discuss his new book, co-authored with Arthur Dahl and Maya Graf, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century, published in 2020 by Cambridge. Augusto is the Executive Director of the Global Governance Forum. He is an international economist with over 30 years of experience in international organizations, including as director of the Global Indicators Group at the World Bank, chief economist and director of the Global Competitiveness Program at the World Economic Forum, and a resident representative for the International Monetary Fund in Russia. He was also senior fellow at the Edmund Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and professor of economics at the University of Chile, Santiago. He has written extensively on a wide range of topics in his field, including European economic integration, determinants of competitiveness, reform issues in transition economies, and economic dimensions of gender inequality. If you're interested in his current work with the Global Governance Forum, a link to the forum's website can be found in the chat box shortly after this introduction. Also joining us today as discussant is Professor Fulya Apaydin. Fulya is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the Institut Barcelona Estudis Internacionals. Her work is situated at the intersection of comparative politics and international studies, with a particular emphasis on the political economy of development. Her current research examines the implications of capital flows on development. Fulya is also a researcher for the GLOBE project, the project behind this webinar series, and she is principal investigator of financial liberalization and authoritarian survival in the Muslim world, FLAS, which is a research project funded by the Spanish Ministry of Science, Innovation, and Universities. We will begin today's webinar with a presentation by Augusto of about 25 minutes. Then Fulya will start off the discussion by offering her reflections and asking a few questions, and Augusto will have an opportunity to respond. Then we will turn to questions from you, the audience. Feel free to send questions to me throughout the webinar by using the webinar chat box function at the side of the webinar window. I will collect your questions to share with the speakers following the presentations. Before we begin, just a few quick words about the GLOBE project. Funded by the European Commission's Horizon 2020 program, GLOBE seeks to understand the constraints and opportunities for the European Union in promoting its interests and values through global governance, with specific attention to 4 key areas: trade and development, security and migration, climate change, and global finance. The 3.5-year project aims to identify the major roadblocks to effective and coherent global governance by multiple stakeholders in a multipolar world, as well as to look ahead to 2030 and 2050 in order to equip policymakers with the tools they need to deal with future challenges. On behalf of the GLOBE project, I would like to thank both Augusto and Fulya for joining us today. And now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Augusto. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It's a pleasure to be with you. I want to express my gratitude for the invitation, and I hope that we have a stimulating discussion over the next 55 minutes. I thought that what I'd like to do at the beginning is to share with the audience something about the sources of inspiration for this book, Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions for the 21st Century. I was in my 20s living in South America when I came upon the work of Grenville Clark, who's a very towering public figure in 20th century United States public life. And in 1958, he had written a book called World Peace Through World Law, which was published by Harvard University Press. And I came upon that particular work. Clark was a very fascinating personality. He was a classmate of Franklin Roosevelt at Harvard Law School. And in fact, they graduated together and they went to work for the same law firm. And so over the next several decades, they were not only close associates, but Clark worked very, very closely during the Roosevelt administration. Later, during the war, he was an advisor to Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War, and was very closely involved in the sort of design and the implementation of the war effort once United States entered World War II. Later on, in fact, for the rest of his life, and during the after World War II and in the 1950s and 60s, Clark spent most of his time promoting world peace. He was deeply disappointed with what came out of San Francisco in 1945. I'm referring to the UN Charter. He did not feel that we took advantage of the opportunity provided by 60 million casualties and the calamity and the collapse of World War II to come up with a stronger organization that would actually be able to deliver on the promises of the UN Charter. Clark's main argument in this book, World Peace Through World Law, was a very simple one. He basically said, we have come to understand the need for national institutions to regulate different aspects of life in a country, to establish a basis for peace and security and prosperity. We understand that we need a parliament, a central bank, we need an executive, we need a judicial system. All those things have become part of what we call civilization. They are seen as essential for progress and prosperity. In a world that is becoming increasingly interdependent, what we need to do is we need to establish these institutions, but on a global scale. That was his argument. And it was very powerfully made in the late 50s in this book, which he co-wrote with one of his colleagues at Harvard University, a law professor by the name of Louis Sohn. Albert Einstein was also very active in these debates. In 1947, he wrote an open letter to the United Nations. And I just want to quote a sentence from that letter. He said, the method of representation at the UN should be considerably modified. The moral authority of the UN would be considerably enhanced if the delegates were elected directly by the people, instead of being diplomats, in most cases representing the party in power. Einstein thought that the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations was a vital principle, and that we needed to establish a firmer linkage between the organization on the one hand and the people that it was meant to serve. And so he was very strongly supportive of a proposal that Clark had made to move the UN to a system of weighted voting in the General Assembly. As you know, in the General Assembly, we have one country, one vote. And he thought that that undermined the whole credibility of the organization. And Einstein was saying, no, we should have a system of weighted voting, and then we should give more powers to the United Nations, in particular in the areas of peace and security. Another person that played a very important role during that period was Bertrand Russell. Bertrand Russell, the English philosopher and mathematician, he was very actively participating in these debates. He was a friend of Einstein. They were in close collaboration and writing to each other. They issued actually a joint statement signed by other leading scientists of the time. And Russell's main contribution was that while the United Nations was being called upon to deliver peace and security, it wasn't given the instrumentality to be able to do so. And so Russell, for instance, was very active, proposing that the United Nations should actually have attached to it an international peace force, something like an army. And you might think, well, that was very ahead of his time, but it's interesting. At that time, when the United Nations Charter was being formulated, they embedded in the charter an Article 43, which has never been implemented, but it's there, and it basically says that the members of the United Nations will give armed forces assistance and facilities to the Security Council for the purposes of maintaining international peace and security. So the legal basis for some kind of system of collective security is already in the UN Charter. And Russell was saying, well, you have accepted this principle, you have put it in the Charter, why don't you give the United Nations then the instrumentality to actually be able to deliver on this principle, rather than it just becoming a kind of a principle that is theoretical but not actually implemented. And in my particular case, last but not least, as a source of inspiration, I would like to mention as an additional source, the head of the Baha'i community, Shoghi Effendi, who in 1931, well before the United Nations was established, said the following. He said, "The fundamental cause of world unrest is our failure to adjust our system of economic and political institutions to the imperative needs of a rapidly evolving age." He was basically referring to what today we call the governance gap, essentially that we have institutions which essentially have not been modernized. They are reflective of a world which existed 75, 80 years ago, but which no longer fit the needs of the time. And I will refer to this a little more in a few minutes. This particular statement of Shoghi Effendi, I think it remains true today as it was 90 years ago when it was first stated. All of these statements by these renowned thinkers highlight, I think, one fundamental irony of our age. In the last 75 years, the world has changed beyond recognition. Some of these changes are linked to the swift expansion of connectivity and complexity, brought about by technological and scientific innovation. Others are in response to rapid population growth and the associated expansion of the global economy. And these forces, have had all manner of repercussions and impact. Some of them have been positive. We have improved living standards. Average life expectancy today is much higher than it was in 1945. Infant mortality has come in a big way. We have made progress until COVID-19. We have made progress in reducing extreme poverty. And we should celebrate these things. They have contributed in some way, to reduce the suffering and need in the world. But all these changes have also brought about other not so desirable things, such as climate change. We have a problem of nuclear proliferation. We have widening income disparities. We have a very vulnerable global financial system, as was shown in 2008, 2009. We have precarious health systems, it seems, and that's certainly an insight that comes out of COVID-19 in 2020. So in a way, we find ourselves in a world in which the institutions that we have, whether it's the United Nations, the World Health Organization, the United Nations and its many agencies like the World Health Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, and many others, they are struggling to cope with the challenges of our increasingly interconnected and interdependent world, because they have largely failed to adapt to the needs of this rapidly evolving age, as noted by Shoghi Effendi. And I think that the consequence of this is that major planetary issues are being neglected and are risking, and we are risking being overwhelmed by a broad range of problems, the solutions to which require effective problem-solving mechanisms and institutions. Now, in the book, my co-authors, Arthur, Dahl, and Maya, argue that the time is ripe today in 2020 or now 2021 to think creatively about modernizing our current UN-based global order in a way that perhaps it wasn't ripe in the 1950s when Grenville Clark came forward with his proposals in World Peace through World Law. And unfortunately, we were in the middle of the Cold War already, and a period of the armaments buildup and basically tension and conflict that lasted through the rest of the century. We think that the time is different now. We think that we need to strengthen our political institutional infrastructures so that our societies are going to be better able to cope with the kind of destabilizing shocks which have become the new normal. COVID-19 is the latest example, of course, but there are many others in recent decades. this order that we have, the sort of institutional framework that currently is before us, centered around the United Nations, has very few credible defenders. In the research that we did leading up to the publication of this book, we did not see many plausible arguments from thinkers, professors, policymakers, media personalities, people who spend their time thinking about, our future and how this future is going to be safeguarded by the kind of system that we have. Nobody's making the case, what, the system that we have is just fine. We can muddle through for the next 50 years or 25 years, and it will be all right. Climate change somehow will sort itself out. Income disparities are going to go away, and we will be successful in reaching the Sustainable Development Goal #1 of eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. Nobody's making that case. Indeed, in fact, quite the opposite. The emerging view is that we live in a world in which no one is in charge. And because of this, because nobody is in charge, we're being constantly surprised by global catastrophes. From the near implosion of the global financial system in 2008, 2009, which you remember. And Fulya, I imagine that you remember particularly intensely because you are from Turkey, as I understand, and that crisis hit Turkey particularly harshly, but it wasn't the only country, it hit everywhere. And of course, COVID-19 in 2020, which has shown just how vulnerable and fragile our economic and other systems are. Indeed, there are people who are arguing that, look, COVID-19 is just a precursor of other things that will come our way in coming years linked to an acceleration of climate change. And so if you believe, as we do, that we are in front of a series of global crises linked to climate change and some of the other vulnerabilities that we have shown, then it seems to me that we need to rethink whether the system that we have as it is today, which underpins our current global order, is adequate, is fit for purpose, or whether we need to start thinking about how to go about amending it. So let me say a few things about the kinds of concrete suggestions that we believe would contribute greatly to reforming the UN architecture, to enhance its effectiveness and to empower it to find sensible solutions to some of the problems that we face. And here I will refer briefly to two short-term proposals and two longer-term reforms. The first one has to do with the establishment of a second chamber attached to the United Nations, something that in the current terminology is called the World Parliamentary Assembly. The idea of establishing a second chamber or a World Parliamentary Assembly has been around since the organization was created in 1945. And here the idea is, how do we enhance the democratic character of the United Nations by establishing a firmer linkage between the organization and the people it's meant to represent. This goes back to the idea of Albert Einstein and in his letter to the UN back in 1947, right? The problem is that, when you read the UN Charter, it says, we the peoples, right? That's how the UN Charter begins, we the peoples, right? But when you actually look at the organization of the United Nations, the people who serve on the General Assembly are diplomats. They represent the executive branches of their respective governments. Often there is no meaningful linkage between them and the people they represent, as is the case, for instance, in non-democratic states, where in fact they represent just the party that happens to be in power. In the book, we contain a number of proposals about how to create this World Parliamentary Assembly. We give it initially an advisory role. We think that it could basically be a forum for the deliberation and for discussion of issues of global importance, and a source of advice to the other UN bodies, the General Assembly, the Security Council, and so on. We actually provide a specific proposal for the distribution of membership. We say each country should have at least one member, and then we use a number of criteria such as the relative population size, the relative size of the economy, and so on, to come up with a structure of membership in the Parliamentary Assembly. In a way, our inspiration for this body is the European Parliamentary Assembly that was set up in 1958. I don't know whether you're familiar a little bit with that fascinating history, but I guess since your institute is located in Belgium, there must be some familiarity with the basic elements of the European Parliamentary Assembly. But it was established with 142 members representing the 6 founding members of the European Union. And little by little, from initially being just a body of parliamentarians who were having this dual role, they were sitting in their respective national parliaments, but also sitting in the European Parliamentary Assembly. By late 70s, the European members moved to direct election of parliamentary representatives. And as you know, what has happened is that what started out as largely a kind of a debating society has evolved into the European Parliament, representing 27 nations with more than 700 members, and having accumulated in the process not just advisory powers, but powers to do legislation on a European-wide basis. We think that this is a useful model for how one could strengthen and give greater authority to the UN. In the book, we argue that it is very important to give greater say and authority to civil society. In the year 2000, Secretary General Kofi Annan made a very interesting, organized a very interesting gathering. Just to give you a little bit of the history, because it's really important for this particular idea. In September of the year 2000, there was the Millennium Summit. It was the largest gathering of heads of state in the history of humanity up to that point. And that was the summit that adopted the Millennium Development Goals, if you remember. Now, a few months before, in May of that year, Kofi Annan invited representatives of 1,400 civil society organizations. Organizations identified with the environment, with human rights, with gender equality, a whole range of issues. And he invited them to come and spend a couple of weeks in New York to essentially debate and consult and talk about, how can we manage our UN system better? What are some of the challenges that we face as a human family? What are some of the areas that we should prioritize for reform, and so on? And these organizations met, and then in September they presented their recommendations to the heads of state and to the United Nations, the General Assembly. We think that this idea, which was a one-off idea in the year 2000, could actually be usefully formalized. That you could have this forum meeting, whatever, every 2-3 years, and that they could then have this advisory role to the UN system. And we think that the arguments in favor of this are really very, very powerful. You would expect that these people coming together representing civil society would not be wearing their national hats. They would, those representatives that carry the German passport would not be representing the interests of the German state, but rather they would be representing the environment, gender equality, human rights, whatever issue it is that motivates them and is the basis for their participation. And I think the UN needs a group of people that will actually look at global problems from the perspective of humanity as a whole, not just the national perspective. In the book, we have an entire chapter that addresses the question of how to strengthen the funding mechanisms of the United Nations. The United Nations has been in crisis for many, many years, is in a very deep budgetary crisis today, because it doesn't have the resources to operate effectively. I don't want to go into discussion of the nature of the UN budget, but you know from the media reports, you know from the things that you read in the newspapers that they're always strapped for resources. Contributions to the UN budget are very asymmetric. The top 10 contributors account for about 70% of the budget. And in time, the system has become very, very complicated and inefficient, and it doesn't deliver the resources to the United Nations at a time when the needs are pressing, they are increasing. Just on the climate mitigation side, we need to have resources available to deal with the problem of climate change, both mitigation and adaptation. And the UN doesn't have the resources. And the UN, you could make the case that is obviously the place, to have debates, meaningful debates, and to design solutions, because it is the one place that brings 193 sovereign nations together to discuss global problems. Right? So we have a whole range of proposals. I don't have the time to go into a detail, although in the Q&A we can discuss this if you're interested. But we come up with proposals that I think have the virtue of simplicity and transparency, and that would significantly increase the volume of resources available to the UN. Very briefly on the longer term reforms, we think that it is absolutely essential that eventually the United Nations be restructured in a way that we have a system of weighted voting in the General Assembly. We allocate an entire chapter in our book, chapter 4, to develop quantified criteria whereby how to distribute the voting power of its 193 members in a way that makes the General Assembly a much more credible organ, which at the moment, unfortunately, is not. Because how can you have a credible organ where China, with a population of 1.4 billion people, has the same voting power as the island of Nauru with a population of 12,000 people, right? And because of that, because that was sort of an issue of design in the early formulation of the United Nations, it has shifted entirely the locus of power to the Security Council, where, of course, we have the veto power, which has greatly undermined the effectiveness and the credibility and the democratic legitimacy of the United Nations as a body. Then finally, on the peace and security side, one of the main flaws of the United Nations is the absence of a reliable international enforcement mechanism, right, to carry out the decisions of the Security Council. We have a long history whereby the Security Council meets, sometimes in the middle of an emergency, sometimes as people are dying, are being slaughtered, there is genocide underway in different corners of the world. It comes to a decision, and then nothing happens, right? Nothing happens because, as Russell pointed out, it doesn't have the instrumentality to enforce its decision. And so this obviously has greatly undermined, the credibility of the organization in the eyes of civil society, the business community, and it is one of the reasons, I think, why the UN has been in crisis already for many, many years. Right? In the book, we think that because the legal basis already exists for a system of collective security, it is contained in Article 43. Then we have a proposal for the gradual establishment of an international peace force that would be attached to the Security Council, and that would obviously operate on the basis of the will of the international community as reflected in the deliberations of the United Nations. Right? And for us, and I am an economist, for me, one of the main attractions of developing a system, an effective system of collective security, is that it would allow for the first time to actually have what we call a peace dividend. Right? Just think, at the moment, we have 193 UN members. All of them feel that they have to have their own army, their own navy, their own air force. I come from Latin America, and I can tell you, in Latin America, we spend annually $60 billion propping up our military establishments, making sure that our air forces have the latest aircraft and that our armies have the latest weapons and so on. And if you ask me, what are the benefits of this massive investment over a 10-year period? It is $500 billion, right? Which for Latin America is a great deal of money. What are the benefits of this massive spending? None whatsoever. Very, very little. This is called, euphemistically by the IMF, it's called unproductive expenditure, but it's actually a massive waste of resources. $60 billion spent on education, on public health, on training our young people, on connecting our children to the internet, on improving our dilapidated hospitals and infrastructure would be much better spent, right? So the lack of a collective security mechanism has drastic economic implications and has slowed down development and has had great costs for humanity. So to conclude, the book is essentially a detailed look about what this all means for the future of global governance. We think that the years ahead are actually leading to the first 100 years of the United Nations in 2045 are a period of immense opportunity. Science and technology have enabled levels of cooperation that would have been impossible in earlier times. And this will open unparalleled prospects for progress. We argue in the book that we must rise to the challenge of these opportunities because not doing so will put at risk our future and the future of our children. The only option left to us now, as we face our challenging future, is to strengthen the machinery of international cooperation as we endeavor to find lasting solutions to the problems of our age. Thank you. I am a little bit over 25 minutes, I apologize. But I think we still have a good chunk of time for comments and for Fulya to say something and for Q&A.
Indeed, I think we're okay on time still. Thank you so much for this very interesting overview. I am very curious to see the other proposals and the more of the details from the book. I personally haven't had a chance to read it yet, but I will do so soon. Now we will turn to Fulya to kick off the discussion, and I would like to remind the audience that they can send their questions through the chat box window for the Q&A part after Fulya. All right, you have the floor, Fulya.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity to engage very much with this actually pretty long book. I must say at the outset that this is actually a pretty ambitious book. It is daring, and one that invites the reader to be also daring, I suppose. I think the authors have essentially written a very detailed manual on how to save the world with a long list of policy recommendations. And the reader can clearly see at the outset that the authors are terribly concerned about the multiple challenges that we face as human species, including, but not limited to, some of the issues that Augusto raised: climate change, probability of nuclear war, inequality, poverty, just to name a few. The problems are big, but the authors also have a solution, a major reform of global institutions by putting the principles of good governance at the center of all the proposed challenges, the proposed changes. Now, this is maybe a rather simplified summary of what they actually put out there. Maybe it doesn't do enough justice because just it's summarized in one sentence. Now, I guess to many readers, this may perhaps seem appealing, but perhaps not fully convincing. I say this because I'm not sure whether everyone would be equally convinced by the problems that the authors identify as major obstacles to solving these rather complex problems. What do I mean by this? So a first problem that the authors repeat on several occasions is the implied obsolescence, or perhaps I should say insufficiency, of the nation state. on the grounds that its institutions are maybe somewhat archaic, for the lack of a better word, and unable to address the collective problems that affect the well-being of everyone. So the authors suggest that the model of nation state is no longer maybe an effective way of organizing the citizens, since nation states naturally defend their own interests, are likely to engage in military campaigns to resolve disputes, and often initiate race to the bottom of the to the detriment of the other fellow humans that live elsewhere. Now, it's hard to disagree with this problems that they identify, but I'm wondering, are the authors maybe too quick in dismissing nation states as unfit to address the challenges that we face today? Because in defending this position, I think the author's inspiration for a world government, I guess, is informed by this historical process behind the formation of the EU and even the US. I mean, there are detailed sections that basically provide a historical overview of how these entities basically came about. But are they also comparable cases? And they are good as inspirations, but they're also comparable to justify as a basis for what they envision. Yes, the EU has achieved so much, but nation states within the EU are very much alive and kicking. And they deliver. I mean, as much as there are problems on certain occasions, they actually deliver on other occasions. And they later in the proposal for global governments, they also warn against too much centralization, for instance. So where does the nation state actually fit in all these proposals? How is it going to be reformed at all? Maybe we can elaborate this a little bit more. And I guess this is not going to be without conflicts. I mean, as someone who has worked in international financial institutions and with politicians from all around the world, I guess you are probably the best informed about how politicians can basically be really adamant in defending their position. So if this is going to be some sort of a peaceful transformation, if this is what you envision, what are some of the incentives to convince global constituencies to abandon maybe their faith in their nation states and support these global institutions for the proposed reforms? Now, I'm asking these questions because more than half of the book, the first nearly 300 pages or so, are dedicated extensively to discuss the history of the UN and the proposed reforms to radically change this institution with very specific, concrete proposals, so that it would be more effective in addressing the global problems we face. And in proposing this agenda to create a World Parliamentary Assembly, International Peace Force, a world government with executive powers that will be binding on the members, a separate judiciary, legislative body, radically revamping the Security Council as we know it, etc. The authors envision a multi-level institutional change, right? And this will be arguably driven not just by the elites and the experts, but also with the inclusion of constituencies. But how will this actually take place? This is where I'm a bit confused. So on the one hand, your expectation is your expectations kind of built on this punctuated equilibrium model of institutional change that you also cite in the book, where external pressures will eventually force the system to change and stabilize and adapt until the next big wave hits. But at the same time, there's also a lot of emphasis on education and values as this gradual change from within. So I'm not sure how these are envisioned to how they are supposed to go together. And moreover, what if the system that we currently live under, even though nobody seems to be happy with it, is much more resilient than we think it is? This brings me to the second issue, which also has to do with the financing of the New World Order. You propose, among other things, a Tobin tax, where financial transactions would be taxed a certain amount, and that would be pooled. But nation states, even today, are having a difficult time kind of, passing it thanks to the structural power of finance, if I can say that. How is that going to be possible? What would be politically viable to implement this in terms of negotiations and incentives for the parties that will be involved in these debates? Further, you propose a reform of the IMF. Is this going to be as easy as it sounds? Your proposals really read very clear and concrete in the book. And you also cite 2008 crisis, which gets plenty of attention with respect to all these debates on reforming the IMF. You are very well aware of the problems caused by this unbridled financialization. But can we also solve these issues with a swift hand of institutional reform? Because I worry that the problem might be much more structural and deeper here. So take one example. The authors suggest that, for instance, during the 2008 crisis, the Fed has practically turned into a lender of last resort. Recent research also confirms this. The Fed has chosen its partners to do these swap agreements quite selectively, right? So I'm just thinking, would reforming, for instance, the IMF by changing the decision-making structure by reallocating power among the members, would this be really an effective solution when the dollar practically continues to be, and is likely to continue to be, the dominant currency? How is that going to change, for instance? A third point has to do with the issue of inequality. You also spend plenty of time elaborating and discussing this issue. You are clearly concerned about the issue of rising inequality. And in proposing a solution, there's a bit of a Rawlsian standpoint I sense in between the lines. And correct me if I'm wrong, you suggest that perfect equality is not the way to go, since it's often unfairness that is the issue. So this is something that made me think a bit. What would a fair level of inequality look like? Is there such a thing? Or do you endorse a Rawlsian solution where inequalities would be tolerated so long as the worse off are better? If so, this sounds, nice and maybe a concrete proposal, but this also comes with quite a bit of political struggle to come to terms with what would be fair and for whom, who decides what's fair, and all sorts of other discussions that follow that. And relatedly, you seem to be somewhat critical of proposals that prioritize economic growth as a solution to inequality. And you also warn in several different occasions your readers of the negative consequences that basically put growth at the expense of everything else. And that doesn't improve the well-being of others. Beyond the discussion in this book, there's currently also a heated debate on whether degrowth is the way to go. For example, by way of reducing the emphasis on GDP growth rate. So my question here is, can you elaborate maybe a little bit on what kind of economic growth policy needs to be promoted? A growth agenda needs to be promoted under this new global governance, reformed institutions under the UN, the IMF. Which sectors need to be prioritized, for example? I'm asking this because on the one hand are also development economists who are worried about the developmental implications of what they refer to as premature deindustrialization. And on the other hand, we have new initiatives that call for greener growth that does not necessarily put industrialization at the center, right? So to me, this looks like a major dilemma that might not be so easy to reconcile. How could the proposals outlined in the book, such as deeper regional and global integration, would address this? To wrap up, also across all issue domains, good governance and the core principles such as accountability and transparency get plenty of emphasis as the way to go forward. So this brings me to, again, a point that I would like to reiterate. Are these really powerful enough to derive the change or the changes that you propose forward? One thing that seems not explained maybe in detail, and maybe I'm missing this, so correct me if I'm wrong, the role of fiscal policy seems to be not at the center of any of these proposals. So what kind of a monetary and fiscal coordination will be necessary under these institutional reforms you propose to ensure financial stability at the global level, curb the power of financial institutions, and avoid systemic risks and economic crises? Now, the book is really very well written, full of detail, really well thought out. But one thing that I'm surprised also to see is there's no separate chapter, for instance, on gender and racial inequality under the proposed reforms extensively. They're discussed, and they're not completely neglected, but there's no separate chapter, right? And why are these issues maybe not classified as global challenges? Do you think that these issues would be eventually resolved once we reach the goals outlined in the book? Once we have these institutional reforms, they would basically go away. If so, what kind of a solution would that entail under the reformed agenda that you propose forward? So I guess there are too many questions. I think there's enough on the table to discuss, so I will stop here. But this has been a pleasure to read. Thank you very much for the opportunity to engage with this very interesting and intriguing work. Thank you.
Thank you, Fulya. And without further ado, I will just pass back to you because it seems like there's a lot to discuss, and we are about 15 minutes away. So on to you.
Fulya, thank you. Thank you very much for a very comprehensive set of remarks. I will try to be brief, given the time constraint. Look, on the issue of the nation state, I completely agree with you. The nation state at many different levels delivers. And there is nothing in our book that suggests that there is no role in the future for the nation state. No. I think to come back to the example that you gave of the European Union, I think that it's a very, very sort of effective model where you apply the principle of subsidiarity, right? This is a well-established principle of that sort of regulates the distribution of power at the different levels of government within the European Union. There are certain things which can be delivered by the nation state. Education, public health, a whole range of issues that it is very important for the government to be close to the people who are the recipients of the services of government, right? But in other areas, the members of the European Union have deferred to supranational institutions. So monetary policy is not done at the level of localities, it's done at the level of the European Union. Environmental policy is done at the level of the European Union. And the European nations increasingly are talking of perhaps moving in the direction of having greater coordination of security, perhaps even establishing a European defense mechanism or army in the future, right? So this is exactly what was embedded in the design of the United States of America when it was created in the 18th century. Some powers were allocated to the federal government, such as the complete monopoly on the use of force. Texas cannot declare war on California and vice versa. It is the Federal Reserve that sets monetary policy and that issues the currency, right? You don't have separate currencies at the level of the 50 states. So they have managed to work on this principle in a way that power is distributed in a way that makes sense in terms of the welfare of the country. That is our vision. That is our vision. We have an entire chapter on the European Union, as you know, precisely because we wanted to highlight, this kind of balance between the role of the nation state on the one hand and the role of a supranational organization in those areas where it makes sense to have international coordination at a much higher level. For me, climate change is the classic example of that, right? What are the incentives for change? You talk about the realism of these proposals, right? I alluded to that a little bit in my own initial remarks when I said that the current system doesn't really have many credible defenders. Not arguing that the nation state has failed completely. No. I was specifically referring as about the ability of the current system to deliver solutions for those global problems which cannot be solved without international cooperation, right? Look, the system as we have it is not delivering solutions to, for instance, climate change. We had the Paris Agreement in 2015, and that agreement is failing. It is failing completely, miserably. Emissions have gone up. No country is fulfilling, very few countries are fulfilling their pledges that they made in 2015. the countries promised that by 2020 they will be delivering, the developed countries, they would be delivering $100 billion per year to the developing world for climate change mitigation and adaptation. Those amounts are nowhere to be seen. And the scientific community is increasingly alarmed that the 2 degrees centigrade target, is increasingly out of reach. We will overreach it. It is increasingly looking that by 2030, we will be far from where we should be in terms of emissions, right? So the answer to your question is, what are the incentives? What are the incentives? Are unmitigated calamity and catastrophe in coming decades, right? And perhaps not even decades, perhaps much sooner than that. Because if you actually look at what the scientists have been saying over the last 30 years, they have tended to be conservative. The reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have tended to be fairly cautious, but the tone of alarm, the tone that is being used by the scientists increasingly as time passes by is louder and louder and louder, because they see the window of opportunity getting narrower and narrower. So if World War II was the incentive for the European nations to come together and create a European Union and to come up with a better way of managing affairs than war and violence, then I think climate change and the associated calamities associated with climate change are going to be the catalyst, to precipitate the kind of changes that we are proposing. Now, obviously, I want to be humble about our proposals. They are intended to be a platform for discussion. There are multiple ways of approaching the problems that we face, and we offer a possible solution. Our intention is to precipitate debate and to encourage the debate, rather than to say that we have a perfect blueprint. We are far from saying that in the book. Very briefly, on the Tobin tax, that in that chapter, we were thinking out loud, what are some possible sources of funding, not just for the UN, but in general for some of the more urgent problems that we face. Climate change mitigation obviously is a serious problem, which at the moment is not getting the kind of funding that we need. The IMF came out with a report about a year ago, which is, I think, one of the better things that they have done in recent years, saying that we should introduce a carbon tax. What is the level on average of a carbon tax today, or at least a year ago when the report was published? $2 per ton. And they say that by 2030, we should move to $75 per ton. There are only 2 countries in the world that today exceed that level, Switzerland and Sweden. Right? Japan has $3 per ton of CO2. Mexico, I think, under 2, right? And so on. It is a very, very depressing, very, very complicated picture, right? So in that chapter where we presented the Tobin tax, we are saying, look, this is something that we can look at, right? If it is a question of how to raise resources, we have a financial sector that has grown by leaps and bounds since Tobin wrote that first article back in the 1970s. And this is a sector where a very small tax can generate a huge amount of resources, which then can be used for climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation. We are writing on first principles. We are less concerned about how politically feasible it is, how politically realistic it is to introduce that tax. For us, that's the wrong question. The wrong question is not what can current politics allow us to do. The question is, what does the world need? And today, what the world needs is a carbon tax, and what we need is vast resources to be able to do climate change mitigation and adaptation. I'm looking at my watch, and I want to make sure that we do have a little bit of time for Q&A. But on inequality, and of course, Fulya, you're partly to blame because you raised a lot of questions. So on inequality, we're not saying that economic growth is bad. No, not at all. I mean, economic growth has been the primary mover or the primary engine of poverty alleviation. But I think it is a legitimate issue to say that economic growth has also brought about the current environmental crisis, right? And so I think we need to rethink a little bit our economic model in ways that deliver prosperity and growth, but do so in a more sustainable way. So let me give you an example, so it doesn't just sound like a slogan, right? Let me give you an example of the kind of thing that we're doing today, which I think is very damaging to future prosperity. We're subsidizing energy to the tune of about $5.3 trillion per year, which is about 6.5% of world GNP, right? So we subsidize electricity, carbon, gasoline, and natural gas. What is the impact of these subsidies, right? Number one, they accelerate climate change for sure, right? They make the problem worse. Number two, they are regressive. And since you talk about inequality, they actually make income inequality worse, because this 60% of the benefits of these subsidies are concentrated on the top 20% of the income distribution, right? So this problem, which we all recognize is a serious problem, income inequality, is actually made worse by energy subsidies, right? So yes, Fulya, we see a role for fiscal policy in the implementation of better economic policies, right? We need to be very, very hard-nosed about our spending priorities. I already said we're spending too much money on defense. We're spending too much money on energy subsidization. We should reallocate those resources to other ends. What? Education, training, public health. Those things that will enhance productivity and improve competitiveness, that will improve the kind of growth that we're getting out of a given level of resources, right? So, I mean, we don't have the time to elaborate on this, but I agree. Having spent more than a decade at the IMF, I do believe in the power of fiscal policy for generating a better sort of economic growth than what we have had in the last several decades, which has led to inequality, which has led to environmental devastation and the kind of crisis that we're confronted today, right? Kari, back to you. Oh yes, on the gender, Fulya, just for the record, right? It is a very relevant question that you wrote. A year and a half before this book was published, which incidentally for the audience is, although you can buy it from Cambridge University Press through Amazon, you can also download it for free, the PDF from the Global Governance Forum website, right? But the year before, I wrote another book called Equality for Women Equals Prosperity for All, right? Because yes, I do believe that women can play a role in bringing about a more peaceful and more prosperous world. And in this book, we, together with one of my co-authors, we actually look at the economic implications of gender equality and why the political and economic empowerment of women, is absolutely vital for better governance in the future. So I'm with you on that one.
All right, thank you so much to both of you. We are almost at the hour, but we have so many nice questions from the audience. If you don't mind, we'll just go a couple minutes over, and hopefully our audience will stick with us for a few more minutes. I know that you mentioned that you didn't go too much into the political feasibility of some of these proposals and that kind of thing. That wasn't really the point, but a lot of the questions were indeed about political feasibility. So we had questions from Patrick Bull and Raymond Dyer and Azmi Kizmisi, who are sort of asking about who would be in favor of this and how would states be incentivized to give up power towards a parliamentary assembly or towards some of these other initiatives that you propose. How can they be sort of convinced of letting some of their power go? So that's like kind of one set of questions that is about political feasibility. And then I have another one from Harris Gleckman, who is asking, over the past 25 years, the intergovernmental system in the economic, social, and environmental spheres have moved to a system of volunteerism by member states and by international business. Do you agree with this volunteerism direction? And if not, how does your proposal or your proposals shift to more legally binding obligatory arrangements? And then we have another set of questions that talk about this proposal for the Parliamentary Assembly and how inclusive or legitimate it might be. Would it become perhaps more elitist or have an authoritarian drift in the end if it's still at the top, or how can we sort of have a more citizen participation and deliberation mechanism sort of built into it? So those questions coming from Rafael Drozuski, and there's another one. Sorry if I'm missing your names. I apologize. And then also a couple of questions wondering about the general level of support. Do you see a need for a campaign sort of geared towards the general population? Do we need to build citizen support for such a movement? So I think we'll end there since that's all we have really time for.
Okay. Thank you. Very briefly. Why would leaders, react positively to these kinds of proposals, right? Well, because I think that we are short of solutions. We think that leaders, especially political leaders, heads of state, prime ministers, and so on, they are attached to power as an end in itself. And I think that increasingly, especially in the context of democracy, which is now the prevailing form of government in the majority of the member countries of the United Nations, leaders care about their credibility, their ability to deliver prosperity and to deliver security to their peoples. Right? Because if you don't, you're booted out of office. Right? With the exception of authoritarian states, right, where the government is deeply entrenched and there is no legitimacy conferred to the government by popular vote. With the exception of those, and we understand there are some pretty big governments that fall under that category, but by and large, the majority of the members of the United Nations are democracies, and in a democracy, the core idea is that if you don't deliver what the population wants, you are voted out of office. But what does the population want today? Well, they want safe water. They want a public health system that works. They want vaccines for COVID-19 so that they can be protected. They want education for their children and so on, right? And so if we're going to be confronting crises in the future linked to climate change, linked to our vulnerable financial system, and some of the other problems that I have mentioned, right? Income inequality, et cetera, then presumably leaders will be searching for solutions to actually deliver these things to their populations. What is the benefit of being the leader of a country like Venezuela, which is going down the tube? Right, where 5 million people have escaped the country and have migrated to other parts of the world because the situation is completely unsustainable. Right? So just as Europe was moved to create the European Union against the background of the destruction of World War II, my argument, or our argument in this book, is that the primary incentive for leaders to reconsider the current system is going to be basically the instability and the suffering and the crisis that will come as a result of unresolved global problems which we're facing today. The World Parliamentary Assembly, at its core, it's a way to actually enhance citizen participation in the UN system. The idea is essentially that you bring in members who are more closely connected to the people because they actually were elected by the people. They're representing the people rather than the government in power, right? So it's a way of rebalancing the distribution of power within the UN system. At the moment, the General Assembly, represents the parties in power. Right? If you bring in something like a World Parliamentary Assembly that has people who have been elected directly by the people themselves, right? Then you add a degree of legitimacy to the whole UN system that is at the moment not there. Perhaps I stop here and you tell me how to proceed.
Thank you very much. I do think that's all we have time for today. So I will pass along the other questions to you in case you're interested, and we can always arrange for follow-up discussions if need be. But before I leave you today, I just want to remind the audience that that our Globe webinar series continues next month with a webinar by David Cohen on business lobbying in the EU. And then in May with Julia Kryenkamp and Tom Pegram on global climate governance. And then in June with Genevieve LeBaron on the failure of existing labor governance in combating modern slavery. So you can register for all of these webinars and catch up on previous episodes, including this one, if you missed any part of it, on the Globe at globe-project.eu. And thank you very much for joining us today. And thank you to the audience for all these questions. We hope you join us again soon. From all of us at the Globe Project, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Fulya.
much. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity. Congratulations on the book.